I'd like to give an example of a recent time when I had what I used to consider a 24-hour bug. And with my understanding of German New Medicine, I have come to understand what was happening in my body in a different way and to no longer see it as just a virus or a bug that caught up with me for 24, 48 hours, but instead a meaningful biological response to something that I have experienced. So in German New Medicine, the initiating point for an experience in which we have symptoms is called a conflict shock, and it's an event that is unexpected. It catches us off guard. We feel very isolated in the moment, and it's distressing in some way. And so when we have this kind of event that is a conflict shock for us, our psyche perceives that event and it sets in process a biological special program that affects the brain and a specific relay within the brain and a corresponding organ. And that biological special program involves a tissue adaptation that is actually designed for our survival. It's to help us to overcome this isolating, caught us off guard situation that we have just come in contact with. So in my example, what happened was I received a very unexpected message that was highly critical, and to me it was insulting, and I was completely caught off guard. I felt very isolated when that happened, and it was distressing to me. And so it met all the criteria for a potential conflict shock. And then I knew that I was probably had experienced a conflict shock because immediately after that, in the couple of days following, I was having all the signs of being in what we call the active conflict phase in German New Medicine. So I was having these swirling thoughts. I was ruminating about this thing that had happened. I was waking up in the middle of the night or very early in the morning thinking about it. I had the classic cold hands, cold feet. So the very sympathetic nervous system response is typical when we're in an active conflict phase, which means our body has experienced a conflict shock and our psyche has then set in motion with the brain and the organ this biological special program. Now at this point, I did not know which biological special program had been initiated because most of the time in the conflict active phase, we don't have any other symptoms. Our body is adapting, but we probably don't know in what way it's adapting until we get to the second phase or the healing phase. So in my example, I spent about 2 days being in this more conflict active sympathetic nervous system state where I was upset, I was thinking a lot about it, and then I used some of my own tools to help myself work through the emotions. And about 2 days later, I started to come to some emotional resolution. I was no longer as upset about it. I started to put it behind me, and I realized that it was okay. It really wasn't going to be a big deal in the long run. And so about the evening of the third day, I started to have symptoms. And what happened first was I started to run a low fever, and I had that, classic being really cold with a fever. I was wearing a sweatshirt and a blanket in the middle of the summer. A fever is a very general sign of coming into a healing state. And what happens is after we've been in this conflict active state and we reach a resolution, which is a practical resolution, like the situation has changed, or we come to an emotional, perceptual resolution, then our body goes into a healing state. So that immediate fever clued me in that I had resolved this issue and that I was going into a healing state. Where before I would have been really upset, like, oh, I'm getting sick, I have a fever, it's terrible. Now I was actually kind of excited because I realized I had resolved this conflict that I was active in before, and I was going into healing. So the fever was a first clue, but that's a very general symptom. And so then I started to have intestinal difficulties and I had diarrhea. So then I knew one of the biological special programs that I was running was a small intestine program, and we call it an indigestible morsel conflict. And what that means is we've had a situation in our life that we just can't digest. We don't want to take it in, we don't want to digest it, and it often involves anger with the small intestine. So during that active conflict phase, I had been building up some cells in my small intestine with the purpose of digesting that thing, in a literal sense, digesting that thing that I couldn't digest. And then when I reached resolution, my body was breaking down those extra cells, and that gave me the symptom of diarrhea. But diarrhea is actually the healing phase. So it's important to note that even though it's not comfortable at all, I realized my body was in the healing phase of this small intestine program that had to do with a situation that I didn't want to digest. And then, so I had that going overnight. And then by the next morning, I also had a stuffy nose, runny nose, congestion, and that's actually a different biological special program. It's called a stink conflict because it has to do with the nose, and it involves the nasal mucosa. When you think about in nature, our noses are there to help us sniff out danger. And so in a stink conflict during the active phase, our nasal mucosa is losing cells to widen the nasal passages so that we can sniff out the danger. It's also important to note that a stink conflict is also called an annoyance conflict or an irritation conflict. So it often comes up in situations where we think that really stinks, that annoyed me, that irritated me, totally stinks. So during that conflict active phase, the loss of cells is usually not noticeable. And then when it comes into healing, our nasal mucosa is restoring those cells with the help of bacteria. And that is when we get the healing symptom of the congestion, the runny nose, the mucus. And even though that's not very comfortable, that is a sign of healing from a stink conflict. So in my case, where I would have thought of this as just some kind of 24-hour bug that I got, I now knew that I had resolved at least 2 biological special programs, a small intestine program for an indigestible morsel and a stink conflict with my nasal mucosa. And fortunately for me, this resolution only took about 24 hours for most of my symptoms. And with German New Medicine, the length, the duration and intensity of the conflict active phase will be mirrored with the intensity of the healing phase. So since my conflict active phase wasn't terribly long, my healing phase wasn't terribly long either. So in about 24 hours, I was done with most of my symptoms and I was just tired for a day or two. But I realized with this knowledge that my body was actually doing these things to adapt, to help me get through this difficult situation. And it helped me have a completely different perspective on how I was feeling and moving through that healing phase and just letting my body do its work rather than feeling angry or upset that I was having symptoms. I hope this helps as you think about what you've been experiencing in your own life.